While not a professor, I worked as a tutor at my university's academic center during college. One of the students I helped was a sports science major who sought tutoring for every single subject. This was because he was barely literate, likely reading at a first grade level. One of his assignments required writing about a significant African American figure. He turned to me and asked what African American meant. This student himself was African American. I don't blame him for his lack of knowledge. I hold every teacher he had responsible for their failure to ensure he was learning. Instead, they simply passed him along, making him someone else's responsibility. My mom isn't a professor, but as a social worker, she supervises college students during their practicums. On one occasion, she accompanied a student on a home visit. The family they were visiting gave them a tour of their farm. While collecting chicken eggs, the family matriarch commented on the small size of some eggs. The student then suggested putting the smaller eggs back into the hen's nest so they could grow larger. This senior in college genuinely believed eggs grew bigger the longer they stayed in the nest, as if they were vegetables. This occurred in a very rural area where a significant portion of the population owns farms or livestock. One of my students once mentioned that he would be 21 years old by the time he finished high school. When I asked why, he explained that he ages 2 years for every calendar year. He was 15, about to turn 16, which he believed equated to 2 years. While he might indeed graduate high school at 21, it certainly won't be for the reason he gave. Although I'm not a professor, a classmate of mine once asked, after a C-section, do they put the baby back in? A student in my class plagiarized during the final exam, which was a take-home essay short answer assessment. The instructions were clear. Cite all sources and write everything in your own words. The most astonishing part? This student plagiarized me, the professor. She tried to pass off my own words as her original work. A colleague of my husband shared a story about a student who approached him after an exam and said, "I didn't know how to answer the questions on the test, so I made up my own questions and answered those instead." The professor replied, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. When I go to lunch, I'm telling all my friends about this." I believe no student was unintelligent. They might simply need proper encouragement. That was until I encountered RJ. RJ was unintelligent. At 21, RJ didn't realize that the chicken we consume is the same as the animal itself. Although I'm not a professor, this occurred back in high school. I was assisting in the library and delivering books to classrooms. I walked into a room where the teacher was angrily lecturing on plagiarism. Apparently, a student had submitted an essay that began with over 25 years of experience in this profession. This took place during the first week of a college anthropology class. Professor, let's name some basic distinctions between humans today and animals. Student, we have a heartbeat. I'm not a professor, but I recall a creative writing assignment where we were given 5 unusual words to include in a poem. I read mine aloud, incorporating all the words, when a classmate erupted in anger, ranting about my use of obscure vocabulary she couldn't understand. A student in my class consistently skipped sessions. I held a group work session every 2 weeks for students to collaborate on homework. This particular student would only arrive in the final 10 minutes to join a group and have their name added to the assignment. That was the only time I saw them. I gave them 0 points for all group work and participation. Participation points were essentially free. Students just had to discuss readings when I called on them. After receiving their grade, the student argued, claiming it was unfair since I didn't require attendance. No, the issue wasn't attendance. It was the fact they contributed nothing and tried to freeload off their classmates. This might not qualify as dumb, but my friend and I visited her uncle's house, where a framed piece of paper hung on the wall. It was a 0 out of 20 score on a true or false quiz. Her uncle, a professor, was so impressed by the feat that he displayed it in his home. One student in criminology class once asked what the difference was between a psychopath and a psychologist. This year, I had a student plagiarize an assignment on the topic of plagiarism. This included directly copying the definition of plagiarism from Wikipedia. Though I'm not a professor, I saw one facepalm when a classmate exclaimed, "Ugh, I don't even know what a verb is." This occurred during an advanced linguistics course for aspiring English teachers. I wouldn't call her unintelligent, but her behavior was certainly perplexing and irritating. She had somehow reached college still relying on bizarre, exaggerated, childlike flirting to achieve her goals, even with female faculty. Watching her was cringe-inducing. She'd tilt her head, twirl her hair, swing her leg back and forth, speak in a semi-childlike tone, and glance upward through her lashes. It was the kind of interaction that made you think, I'm only speaking to her when there are witnesses. She once told me she was studying diligently every evening but still failing her exams and needed guidance. I explained how to create written study tools to better retain information. She claimed she'd already done so and reviewed them often, but still couldn't improve her performance. Concerned, I asked her to bring her study materials to our next class so we could evaluate them together. She agreed. When the next class arrived, she dramatically declared with even more exaggerated behavior that she'd been so upset about her test score from before our previous conversation that she'd angrily thrown all her study materials away. They were gone, as if they'd never existed. I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "You might want to consider that a lack of self-discipline could be affecting your grades." She reacted with an indignant huff and pout, and I never saw her again. What's saddening is the likelihood that her family had taught her these behaviors worked. No one clings to such habits unless they've been successful with them before. I'm a high school teacher. Years ago, I showed my students clips from Romeo and Juliet. One student stared at the screen, completely puzzled, before asking with utmost seriousness, how can he be in this movie? He died in Titanic. A friend of mine was substituting for a high school math class and was tasked with proctoring a test. During the exam, one student approached him to ask what 8x7 equaled. Before he could reply, another student interjected, "Sit down. He doesn't know that. He's a substitute teacher, not a math teacher." This happened during my senior year of high school. Our teacher was explaining the phases of the moon when a girl raised her hand to ask, "Do other countries have moons too?" She genuinely believed the moon belonged solely to the United States. I had a student submit an art history essay about Leonard da Vinci. The entire paper referred to him that way without once running spell check or verifying the name. One of the brightest students in my class had questionable ethics and social awareness. After the semester ended, he emailed me to ask if I'd tell my next group of students that he was selling his digital textbook. Oh, and since it was a PDF, he could sell copies to multiple buyers. I replied that while his entrepreneurial mindset was impressive, asking his professor to help promote a piracy-based book business wasn't a great idea. As a French teacher, I'm unsure if this counts, but here's an example. The class was assigned a lengthy French homework task, and one student decided to use Google Translate. However, instead of translating to French, they translated the entire assignment into Spanish. I once gave a university student a C on a philosophy paper. She stared at me and said, "Do you know who my father is?" To this day, I have no idea who he was, but her grade stayed the same. I'm not a professor, but this moment from high school always comes to mind. In 10th grade, a girl in my class asked the teacher how long it would take a submarine to travel from Florida to California by going under the country.